In a time of war fatigue and galactic exhaustion, peace seems like the obvious next step. But humanity, once known for diplomacy and restraint, now refuses every single peace proposal. And no one understands why, until it's too late. What does Earth know that no one else does? What are they waiting for? And when the truth is revealed, the galaxy realizes this was never about peace. It was about ending something. Forever. The last war everyone wanted to end. The war had gone on too long. Everyone said it. Everyone agreed. Even the species who started it. Even the ones who profited from it. They all wanted it over now. Too many lost ships. Too many broken colonies. Too many names carved into walls. This was supposed to be a short campaign. Quick. Contained. Clean. Instead, it stretched across decades. And by the end, no one even remembered what the first shot was about. The galaxy was tired. Not defeated, just exhausted. And so the peace talks began. Quietly at first. A closed-door meeting between neutral parties. Back-channel messages. Unofficial envoys. Then, when no one died for a few months, things went public. Treaty drafts. Broadcasted declarations of goodwill. Pledges from war-torn systems to rebuild. And for the first time in a generation, hope started to flicker. A fragile, flickering light. And at the center of it was Earth. Humanity. They weren't the biggest force in the galaxy. Not the wealthiest. Not the oldest. But they were loud. They were everywhere. And they mattered. Everyone agreed. If Earth accepted peace, the rest would follow. Their silence was taken as a sign of deliberation. Care. Consideration. The hallmark of a species that weighed consequences carefully. Some called it wisdom. Others called it politics. But everyone waited. The first official peace proposal came from the Allied Rim worlds. Generous terms. Full ceasefire. Reparations. Shared reconstruction rights. It was balanced. Diplomatic. The kind of deal species had died waiting for. They sent it to Earth. They waited. 2 days. Then 5. Then 9. No answer. No statement. No rejection. No acceptance. Just silence. So they sent another proposal. Softer terms. More concessions. A symbolic apology added in. Still nothing. A third draft was sent. This time co-authored by the Central Council. It included everything Earth had ever asked for: public accountability, survivor compensation, independent investigations. They thought it was enough. It had to be. They waited again. And then, finally, Earth responded. The message was 6 words long. We decline. Peace is not accepted. No explanation. No list of demands. No counteroffer. Just that. The council chambers erupted. Confusion. Fury. Outrage. Ambassadors demanded clarification. Allies pleaded for reason. Even enemy commanders, half expecting execution, blinked in disbelief. Because this wasn't the Earth they remembered. The Earth that once stood for diplomacy. That called for restraint when others rushed to arms. That had once offered mercy to prisoners before they even surrendered. This new silence was something else. It wasn't a delay. It wasn't arrogance. It wasn't even anger. It was focus. And, in time, some began to notice it. The way human fleets had repositioned quietly. The way old colonies, once thought abandoned, began broadcasting again. The sudden surge of activity on their deep space shipyards. None of it looked chaotic. None of it looked rushed. It looked scheduled, prepared. A dozen proposals followed. Every one of them declined. Some weren't even acknowledged. And the strange part was, Earth wasn't broadcasting propaganda. They weren't rallying the public. They weren't talking to the galaxy at all. They were just moving. Every conversation now started with the same question. Why? Why wouldn't Earth accept peace? Why would a species that once begged for diplomacy now stand silent as the war collapsed? And then, the darker question, what were they waiting for? Because someone finally said the words out loud. The humans weren't avoiding peace. They were waiting for something. And whatever it was, whatever condition they hadn't yet seen met, it was coming soon. Because Earth had stopped talking, and they had started listening. The first refusal. It was meant to be the final draft. The best minds from over a dozen species had worked on it. They stripped out the arrogance. They polished every word. They added gestures of humility that had never before appeared in council history. It was flawless. reasonable, earnest. And this time, they didn't just send it to Earth. They hand-delivered it. A neutral courier fleet, guarded, protected, escorted to Earth's edge under white flag transponders. Every protocol followed, every cultural note observed. The fleet arrived in soul space, drifted toward Earth orbit, held position just beyond the Terran defense net, and waited. There was no challenge, no warning lights, no weapons locking, just silence. For 2 days, they held their position. On the third day, a single Terran vessel rose from Earth's surface. Unarmed, civilian, no transponder code, no signal. It drifted toward the courier ships like a shadow in the void. They hailed it. No response. Then it transmitted. Not a broadcast, not a recording. A live human voice, flat, calm, deliberate. It said, "Your proposal has been reviewed." A pause. "We decline." That was it. The message ended. The ship turned, returned to Earth, and vanished into the clouds. At first, the courier fleet assumed there had been a mistake. A signal loss. An incomplete message. They tried again, repeated the transmission, asked for clarification, begged even. No answer. No return signal. No diplomats. No lights in the dark. Just silence. And behind that silence, movement. The Terran defense net activated. Not weapons, logistics. Dozens of support vessels launched into orbit. Civilian grade, but heavily modified. Their identifiers were encrypted. Their destinations unknown. And every human installation within soul space went dark, electronically and visually. No transmissions. No pings. No sensor data. A curtain had fallen. The courier fleet returned empty. And when they brought the message to the council, they were met with disbelief. Then outrage. How could humanity refuse peace? How could they ignore such carefully crafted concessions? Even species who had once feared Earth now found themselves confused, worried. This wasn't how humans behaved. But the old ambassadors, the ones who had been around before the first expansion wars, stayed quiet. Because they'd seen this before. They'd seen what it looked like when humans stopped trusting the process, when they stopped believing in diplomacy, when they stopped giving second chances. One of them, a Dravari elder with a voice like sand over stone, said it out loud. "This is not vengeance. This is not hate. This is the beginning of something you won't be able to stop. Because humans, when wounded, will bleed. But humans, when betrayed, will wait. They will build. They will focus. And they will remember. The war may have left them bruised, but it had not broken them. And the refusal wasn't emotional. It wasn't loud. It wasn't cruel. It was something far more dangerous. It was cold. It was quiet. It was certain. The council sent another proposal. No response. Another. Still nothing. The Galactic Syndicate held a vote, urging Earth to reconsider. Even their former enemies supported it. But the Terran seat at the table stayed empty. And then, as if to punctuate the message, the Soul Gate was sealed. No traffic in. No traffic out. The humans had closed their doors. And now the galaxy had to face the truth it had tried to avoid. Earth wasn't waiting for better terms. They weren't stalling. They weren't posturing. They had decided. Peace would not come through words. Not this time. Because Earth wasn't seeking balance. They were seeking closure. The galaxy begs. They tried everything. Diplomats from across the stars flew to Earth's neighbors, called in old favors, brought gifts, offered apologies for crimes they hadn't committed. They appealed to logic, to mercy, to exhaustion. But Earth didn't respond. Not with words. Not with gestures. Not even with threats. Because Earth wasn't threatening anyone. They were simply not accepting peace. And that made it worse. The absence of rage made the silence more terrifying. If they'd shouted, if they'd demanded revenge, there would have been something to negotiate with. But there was nothing. The humans had withdrawn from every table, closed every diplomatic line. They were not protesting. They were not grieving. They were quiet. Council fleets repositioned nervously. Human trade networks dissolved. Their embassies emptied. Civilian ships changed their flight paths with no explanation. Then the black fleets began to move. They weren't marked. No flags. No identifiers. but everyone knew what they were. Old designs, old hulls, ships that hadn't flown in decades. Earth's war fleets, polished, upgraded, awake, dozens of them, slipping through fringe systems, disappearing into deep space, moving like wolves through fog. No broadcasts, no public declarations, just motion. They weren't massing for battle. They weren't chasing territory. They were encircling something, and no one knew what. Council chambers were filled with noise, panic, accusations. Allies blamed each other. Old enemies reopened ancient wounds. And through it all, Earth said nothing. The Council passed resolution after resolution urging Earth to return to the table. They offered reparations, offered control of disputed systems, offered sovereignty over half a dozen neutral zones. Still, Earth said nothing. Then came the appeals. A Goral monk spoke on the council floor, his voice trembling. Humans once saved my world from starvation. They airlifted grain across 200 light years. They did it without asking anything in return. That was the Earth I knew. He paused. If that Earth is still out there, please hear us. We are not all your enemies. His words echoed. They were sincere, raw, and Earth ignored them. Because this wasn't about public relations. This wasn't about persuasion. This was about a line that had already been crossed. And every moment of silence from Earth wasn't indecision. It was movement, because somewhere behind the curtain, they were still building, still shifting, still watching. A Terran scientist, long since retired, was interviewed in secret. He was once a civilian liaison to the council. He spoke off record, voice low. They think this is stubbornness, he said. It's not. It's purpose. The mistake wasn't made today. It was made the moment Earth buried its civilians under rubble and was told to forgive. You don't ask a species to heal while they're still bleeding. And you don't tell humans to forget. The interviewer asked him what Earth was planning. He looked into the lens and said, they're not planning anything. They already planned it. Now they're waiting. And the council began to understand. Earth hadn't refused peace out of pride, or pain, or even anger. They had refused because the war wasn't over. Not yet. Not for them. Because the war hadn't ended with a treaty. It had ended in betrayal. And no treaty can erase that. Every time the council begged for peace, humanity heard only one thing. Forget what was done to you. Forget the burned colonies. Forget the children. Forget the false treaties that cost lives. Forget how they smiled while you bled. And Earth, quietly, methodically, answered back. No. The world waited, watched, prayed for peace. And the humans? They just kept moving. Not toward peace. Toward something else. And no one, not even their oldest allies, could stop them. Because you can reason with a species that's still negotiating. But Earth wasn't negotiating anymore. They were preparing for the end. Ghosts of the first betrayal. There had been peace before. That was the part the galaxy always forgot. 100 years ago, long before the current war, Earth had stood in the same place. Wounded, tired, desperate for peace. And they were offered one. It was elegant, perfect on paper. A ceasefire negotiated by neutral parties. A promise of amnesty. Assurances that both sides would rebuild together. The Terran delegation, young, then believed in it. They wanted to. They accepted the terms. Signed a charter. Lowered their weapons. And 3 days later, it happened. It wasn't a surprise attack. It wasn't even called a battle in the official records. It was labeled an unfortunate misunderstanding. But the truth was simple. Earth trusted too quickly. Pulled its fleets back. Let colonies go unguarded. And one of those colonies, Veridan, paid the price. A small world, mostly agricultural, populated by families, workers, engineers. It wasn't strategic. It wasn't valuable. It was just vulnerable. And they came for it. No warning. No declaration. Just a sudden drop from orbit. Bombardment from above. Troop landings. Executions. By the time the nearest Terran fleet arrived, the ground was glass. 53,000 dead. No survivors. No reason. And the attackers? They offered an apology. They said it was confusion. Said they thought the colony had weapons. Said someone didn't get the ceasefire update in time. Then they smiled, shook hands, and expected Earth to move on. Because that's what civilized species do. They forgive. They forget. But Earth didn't forget. They buried their dead. They rebuilt the colony. And they wrote something in the soil beneath the new central square. Never again. Not as a threat. Not as propaganda. As a promise. Passed down quietly. Spoken in training grounds. Carved into the steel frames of Terran warships. It became the unofficial doctrine of Earth's defense forces. Peace is not real until memory is honored. But the galaxy didn't want to honor memory. They wanted clean endings. Negotiated silence. A chance to wipe away guilt with a signature. And Earth let them believe that. For a while, they played the game, joined the council, shared resources, smiled during the speeches. But they remembered Veridan. They remembered Alara, Varen Station, the Kirill Accords. Every time peace was declared, Earth lowered its guard. And every time, someone tested that silence. So when the latest war began, Earth wasn't surprised. They fought, held their lines, did what they had to do. And when the enemy finally asked for peace again, when the same kind of treaty was offered, once more, neatly packaged and apologetic, Earth declined, because they remembered, not out of hatred, but out of duty. They would not let another Veridan happen. Not again. Not because someone else was in a hurry to feel innocent. And that's why every peace proposal was met with silence. It wasn't stubbornness. It was history, burned into their bones. That it didn't trust the words. They trusted what came after the words. Because Earth learned the hard way. Peace is never real when it's offered by the same hand that held a knife. And this time, they would not reach for it. Not until the blade was gone. Not until memory had been paid for in full. One Terran commander, anonymous, off-record, was asked what Earth wanted from the galaxy. He didn't hesitate. He said, "We want peace. But we want peace that doesn't start with forgetting. We want peace that doesn't require our dead to be ignored. You don't get to kill civilians and call it even with a signature. You don't get to burn our homes and ask for patience. You don't get to do what they did and expect us to be quiet just because you're tired of hearing us scream." The council didn't understand, but the veterans did. The ones who remembered the silence after Veridan. The ones who helped clean the ash from school walls. The ones who made the same promise Earth made that day. Never again. And now, as the wars stumbled toward its final days, and the galaxy asked once more for forgiveness, Earth said no, not with hate, but with clarity, because they had learned, and they were done teaching the same lesson twice. Strategic silence. Silence is often mistaken for weakness, for hesitation, for fear, for uncertainty. But silence, when measured, when deliberate, is something else entirely. It's a warning. Earth had gone quiet, not just diplomatically, not just politically, militarily. No broadcasts, no threats, no movement that anyone could see, but they were moving. They always had been. At first, it was subtle. A recon drone here, a convoy rerouted there, civilian vessels decommissioned and quietly stripped for parts. Then came the fleet disappearances. Dozens of ships vanished from Earth's official registries. Not destroyed, not missing, reclassified. The data trail ended. No explanations given, no destinations listed, only coordinates erased. The Council thought Earth was playing defense, bracing for second front, consolidating power, protecting its borders. But Earth wasn't circling the wagons. They were drawing the net. One analyst finally pieced it together. She was young, not a politician, not a general, a data technician in a quiet corner of the Drellin Accord. She wasn't even looking at Terran fleet positions. She was monitoring hyperspace traffic patterns. And she saw it, in the mess of overlapping jumps, the strange gaps in traffic, the odd timing of fleet transits. She saw a shape. It was subtle, beautiful, and terrifying. They weren't retreating. They were encircling. Quietly, Earth's forces had spread across fringe systems, cutting off critical junctions, key relay points, fuel depots, sensor hubs. One by one, these locations had gone silent, not destroyed but disconnected. And now, if the enemy moved, they'd be seen. If they ran, they'd be trapped. If they stayed, they'd be cornered. The humans hadn't stalled the war. They'd outflanked it, slowly, silently, precisely. The analyst submitted her findings to her superior. They dismissed it. said it was speculative, so the humans wouldn't act without announcing it first. She didn't argue. She just archived the data, sat back, and whispered the same thing Earth had been whispering for months. They don't need to say anything, because by now, it was clear Earth wasn't ignoring peace. They were replacing it. Replacing talks with targets. Replacing signatures with systems shut down. Replacing delay with design. Their fleets weren't on patrol, they were in position. And no one knew when they'd strike. Because that was the point. The silence had never been stillness. It had been timing. The kind of timing you only learn when you've been burned before. The kind you carry when peace once cost you your children. And now, Earth was watching, waiting, for one last condition to be met. Not surrender, not apology, but exposure. And then, when the moment came, there would be no debate. No second draft of a treaty. No desperate call for ceasefire. Just execution. Clean, controlled, final. The kind of end that doesn't need explanation. Because Earth had already explained everything. In their silence. The warning that wasn't heard. It came like an echo from a dead channel. A message. Simple. Unencrypted. No fanfare. Just a voice. Calm. Steady. Unmistakably human. Broadcast across neutral space. Delivered to every major diplomatic network. No threats. No names. No emotion. Only this. Peace will come. But not while those who profit from war still speak for the dead. That was all. It wasn't repeated. It wasn't explained. No press release followed. No fleet appeared behind the message. And most of the galaxy ignored it. Some dismissed it as a political riddle. Some called it Terran melodrama. Others believed it was a bluff, one last plea for leverage. But it wasn't any of those things. It was a warning. Not shouted. Not dramatized. Not wrapped in fire. Just spoken. Like a final courtesy. A way of saying, this is your last chance to understand. This is your last chance to listen. And no one listened. The message was archived. Filed. Forgotten. Except by the ones who had heard a version of it before. The old veterans. The historians. The children of Veridon and Alara. They knew that voice. They knew its stillness wasn't peace. It was precision. Poise. Preparation. One of them, an elder stateswoman from a forgotten moon, long since retired, stood up in a council meeting after the broadcast. She said, "That's not a threat. It's not a metaphor. That's a lock clicking shut." But no one believed her. Because humans had spoken so often of peace in the past, had offered olive branches after fire, had forgiven when no one else would. So surely, this was more of the same. Surely, this message, cold as it sounded, was just Earth trying to scare them into softer terms. And so the galaxy moved on, resumed its discussions, polished its proposals, built new documents, drafted new reparations, another treaty, another summit, another chance to fix things with words. And while they wrote and talked and bargained, Earth moved, not with banners, not with battle cries, just black fleets sliding into position, automated systems going live, communications networks rerouting data into blind zones. And still, the message sat in every diplomatic inbox, unread, unopened, ignored, until, one day, a station went dark. Not a Terran station, a neutral one, sitting at the heart of the Outer Arm, the largest transit hub for diplomatic transport in the entire quadrant. It disappeared from the grid. No explosion, no signal, no debris, just gone. Search teams found it 10 hours later, floating, powerless. Systems intact, no structural damage, but empty. Every diplomat, every crew member, every passenger vanished. Like Alara, like Veridon, and scrawled on the wall of the main concourse, carved into steel, with the same words from Earth's final message. Not painted, not projected, carved. Peace will come, but not while those who profit from war still speak for the dead. It wasn't a warning anymore. It was a signature. That was when the panic started. That was when the council finally stopped drafting new offers. Stopped pretending Earth could be reasoned with. Stopped thinking peace was a negotiation. Because it wasn't. Not now. It was a countdown. And it had already begun. It didn't begin with a battle. It began with absence. One morning, an enemy logistics hub failed to report in. No alarms. No distress signals. Just silence. Then a mining outpost. Then a weapons depot. Then an orbital shipyard. Gone. All within a span of 3 hours. No sign of attack. No wreckage. No survivors. The council scrambled. Command centers lit up. Fleets were mobilized. Warnings were broadcast to every friendly system. But there was nothing to respond to. No declared war. No advancing fleet. Just missing pieces. And then Earth moved. The Black Fleets came out of hiding. Not in chaos. Not as a wave. They emerged in formation. Like dancers on a silent stage. They had already mapped the exits. Already locked the routes. Already calculated the distance from every target to every last beacon. And when the final confirmation code was spoken back on Earth, the strike began. 37 targets in the first 12 hours. Command hubs. Supply chains. Capital ships. Gone. No prolonged combat. No drawn-out engagements. Just entry. Execution. Exit. They didn't disable. They didn't warn. They didn't ask. And when resistance came, Earth's AI-driven countermeasures turned it to vapor before it even finished deploying. The enemy called a massacre. Earth called it a completion. The Council called an emergency session. Began transmitting open surrender offers. Earth didn't respond. Because Earth wasn't listening anymore. They already had their list. Their coordinates. Their names. The fleets moved without error. Not with brutality. Not with cruelty. With efficiency. As if the war had always been a math problem. And now someone had finally solved it. Entire worlds were left intact. Power grids still humming. Libraries untouched. Civilian shuttles rerouted to safety before impact. But the command class? The war planners? The profiteers? Gone. Cleanly. Perfectly. The final enemy homeworld fell without a single building damaged. Their sky filled with Terran warships. They expected fire. Instead, Earth dropped automated drones. Thousands of them. Each one carrying a single data packet. Names. Dates. Evidence. Proof of what had been done. And a message. We didn't forget. And we don't need to explain. The drones self-deleted after transmission. There were no soldiers on the ground. No occupation forces. No declarations of victory. Because Earth didn't want power. They wanted closure. 2 days later, the last of the enemy fleets surrendered. They weren't asked to. They simply stopped. And still, Earth said nothing. The ships turned. Drifted back into the black. No celebration. No anthem. No flag raised. Just a final system purge. And silence. The galaxy watched, stunned. There had been no great battle. No war-ending treaty. Just surgical removal. The kind of end you only plan when you've already buried your dead. And finally, one council member said what everyone else was too afraid to voice. This wasn't vengeance. It wasn't even war. It was a correction. Earth had rewritten the rules. Peace would no longer be a negotiation. It would be a responsibility. A price paid in memory. In restraint. In the unshakable knowledge that if you betray it again, the silence will return. Peace comes after silence. The war was over. No one announced it. No treaty was signed. No dates were carved into history. But the fighting stopped. Because there was no one left to fight. Earth didn't send representatives to claim territory. They didn't occupy conquered space. They didn't even respond to calls for negotiations. They just vanished. The Black Fleets faded back into the void. No records of where they went. No signals left behind. The Sol system went quiet again. The humans didn't return to the Council. Didn't rejoin trade networks. Didn't offer conditions for peace. They simply stepped away. And for the first time in living memory, the stars were still. The galaxy waited. Surely, Earth would speak. Surely they would issue demands. But months passed. Then years. And all that came from Earth was silence. Not cold. Not angry. Finished. Some species tried to fill the void. Declared new alliances. Rebuilt old stations. Held forums on peace and memory. But it wasn't the same. Because no one forgot what Earth had done. Not in rage. Not in conquest. In resolution. They didn't destroy the enemy. They removed them. Systematically. Surgically. With no need to explain themselves. Because the proof had already been burned into history. And now, the galaxy lived differently. Carefully. Not out of fear. but respect. New treaties were shorter, clearer, enforced with sincerity. The word peace was no longer spoken lightly. And in every military academy across the stars, one phrase became mandatory curriculum. Silence is not the absence of war. It is the presence of restraint. They didn't teach Earth's tactics. Most of them were never recovered. Most were never even seen. But they taught what came before it. The warning, the refusals, the quiet. Because every species remembered what they had missed. That Earth had given them a chance. Spoken clearly. Once. And they had not listened. Now, they listened to everything. In one distant archive, a hologram loops quietly. The only remaining copy of Earth's final words, spoken before the last strike. A voice, calm, quiet, certain says, "We will have peace, but not before the memory has weight. Not before silence means something. Not before justice speaks louder than apology." And then it ends, and nothing more is needed. Generations pass. New species rise. Old empires fade. And still, the story of Earth lives on. Not as conquerors, not as monsters, as a warning, as a lesson, as the silence that followed the last time peace was taken for granted. Because the galaxy did not rebuild on the ruins of war. It rebuilt on the discipline of memory. And whenever a leader stands on the edge of escalation, whenever a young soldier asks why diplomacy must be honored, someone always answers the same way. Because Earth is still out there, and they're listening, not with anger, but with patience. And the next time peace is broken, they won't explain twice. Final line, soft, unshakable. They called Earth unreasonable. They called them stubborn. They called them dangerous. But after all the silence, all the fire, all the years, the galaxy finally called them what they always were, right?